The desert wind carried the scent of sweat, dust, and fear. On a wooden platform, an Apache woman stood tall despite the rope biting her wrists. The crowd laughed, tossed coins, and called her savage. But her eyes, wild and burning, met theirs without a tremor. When the auctioneer raised his hand, she spat at the ground and whispered, "I'd rather die." The air froze. Then, a lone cowboy stepped forward, dropped $3 on the block, and changed the meaning of mercy forever. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The sun sat like a hot coin over the frontier town, baking wooden skin until even the shadows seemed to sweat. Wagons creaked, boots scuffed, and the murmurs of the crowd formed a hard, dry sound that matched the dust in the air. On a raised platform of rough boards and ropes, an Apache woman stood with her wrists bound, a thin braid threaded with bone and cloth hanging against her back, her face streaked with dust and dried blood but set with a steady, terrible pride. Men spat at her feet, some laughed. Children craned their necks to see the savage on the block while older men averted their eyes and pretended not to know what conscience felt like. The auctioneer's voice cut with the practiced rhythm of a man who sold other people's fate like merchandise, naming prices in terms as if selling horses or land. His words were slick and cold, meant to deaden pity before it could rise. Rumors have come ahead of the sale, stories of raids and reprisal, of stolen stock, of houses burned, and they swelled in the crowd like summer thunder that never broke. She did not beg, though the rope bit at her wrists and her breath came shallow from heat and the aftershock of violence. Instead, she stood like a column of weathered stone, each small movement a testament to survival. The old men laughed the cruel laugh, the women clutched and crossed themselves. Some hands turned away as though the sight could turn us them, and somewhere a child asked a question that the adults pretended not to hear. As bids rose and the spectacle sharpened, a single new sound threaded through the square, the measured clop of a horse, simple, solitary, and it made heads turn as if a bell had rung. At the edge of the crowd, a lone cowboy dismounted, his hat pulled low, his coat dusted like the rest but his gait oddly quiet. He moved without the swagger that usually accompanied men who bought and sold, and the hush that followed him felt like the cut of a knife. He walked to the platform with no flourish and placed $3 on the rough board with the slow, deliberate calm of a man who had counted his losses and decided the last coin was worth throwing down. A murmur rose, confusion, then laughter edged with suspicion, because no man in that town ever bought an Apache without a sharp, ugly reason. The assumption was cruelty or profit, never mercy. The auctioneer barked a challenge, voice rising to bait for bigger bids, but the cowboy's face held no negotiating smile. Instead, he looked up and met the woman's gaze, and for a suspended instant the dust and the jeers dimmed around them. Her eyes, dark, fierce, and ancient with grief, fixed on him not with pleading but with a test, a measure. She spat at the dirt, the motion small and fierce, and the words that slipped out were a blade rather than a plea. "I'd rather die." The sentence fell and the square stilled. Some called her mad, others brave, and a few felt the sting of something like shame at their own appetite for spectacle. The cowboy picked up the coins, not as a purchaser but as a witness, and offered them to the town's ritual as if to say the account was settled in a different ledger. When the ropes were cut and he guided her down from the block, there was no clanging of applause, only the low, unreadable sound of men trading their glances like cards. He led her away not as a master leading property but as a man who had made a jagged, uneasy promise. The $3 would not buy them safety in law or favor in the eyes of the many, but they bought a single thing that mattered beneath the thunder of history: an opening, a breath, a chance to choose between death and a road that might lead somewhere other than suffering. As they slipped through the back alleys and out toward the scrub, the town returned to its petty business and the wind picked up the loose, bitter scent of the day. Yet beneath the normal churn a new question wound through like a hidden stream. What does mercy cost, and who will be brave enough to pay it? He loosened the ropes with hands that moved as if remembering a gentler work, fingers swift and sure, then swung up into the saddle and waited. The horse shifted, cropping at the dry grass, and the town's heat rolled off the planks like a living thing, pressing them both into a narrow, private world. She remained on the dirt where they had lowered her, wrists raw, shoulders coiled, eyes black and bright and untrusting. When he tilted his hat and made the quiet gesture toward the trail, she answered not with a nod but with a glare sharp as a thrown stone, a silent refusal that said plainly she would not be led like an animal. For a long moment they measured one another under the fierce sun, one man who had dropped $3 silver as if cutting a knot, one woman who had watched her world burn and would rather meet dust than live under another man's hand, and the space between them filled with a heavy, double-tongued language of suspicion. He rode a few paces and looked back without haste. The softness in his gesture was not pity so much as a cautious offering of choice. She did not step forward. She stayed, a statue in the heat, every muscle tuned to flight or fight. When he put the horse into a steady walk and began down the wagon track, she hesitated, then followed at a distance, keeping to the scrub and the burn-scarred hedgerows as if she expected men with ropes to leap out from behind every clump of sage. The path they took on rolled like a ribbon through hills of brittle grass and sun-bleached rock, and the town fell away behind them, its gossip and coin and cruelty shrinking into nothing but a smear on the horizon. Silence settled between rider and follower, not like peace but like a new kind of restraint, denser than any cord. No small talk, no bargains, only the horse's footfall and the faint susurration of wind pulling at their clothes. She watched him through the corner of one eye, reading his posture, the set of his shoulders, the pace of his breathing, as if cataloging whether he might be trusted to keep a promise. He did not insist. He rode as if honoring the shape of her refusal, patient in a way that made patience look like another form of courage. When they paused at midday beneath scanned shade, he dismounted slowly and offered her bread wrapped in coarse cloth. She accepted it with emotion as guarded as drawing a knife, tore at it with fingers that betrayed hunger, and then ate in a silence edged with old rage. At night, when the fire burned low and cicadas hammered the dark, the space between them tightened further into something almost conversational, small observations voiced into the warm air, more like weather reports than confession. Once, he said, almost to himself, that he'd learned to measure a man's worth not by his coin but by what coin he was willing to lay down when there was nothing to be gained. The words were simple and unadorned, meant more to name a fact than to plead for understanding. She listened, jaw slackening only a little, and in the wavering light of the embers she allowed a memory to surface. A raid, a child carried off, a house aflame reflected in the water, a storm of grief she had kept caged and sharpened into survival. The sound of his breathing was steady. She heard in it the rhythm of someone who had ridden through storms of his own. Trust did not arrive with any sudden clarity. It came like a slow weather change, imperceptible at first, then undeniable. By dawn they had settled into a cautious pattern. He would ride a bit ahead, she would follow at a measured remove, and between them the silence grew less like a chain and more like a bridge, each wary step laying down a plank. The road ahead promised no reprieve. Soldiers, bounty hunters, the long reach of towns with hungry coin. But for the first time since the auction block she possessed something she had not been offered before, the option to choose her path, and with that option the thin, sharp thread of hope began to stitch itself into the open wound of her days. They made camp beneath a sky that bled red into black, the horizon a thin, furious wound where the sun had gone down. The fire between them threw up a shaking, half-hearted light that seemed to define the distance as surely as the rope had, and each flicker painted their faces in alternating truth and shadow. He set a small pot over the coals and offered her a crust wrapped in coarse cloth, the gesture simple and ordinary as a man offering bread. But she took it like a measure of danger, fingers closing cautiously around the cloth, eyes never leaving his hands. She refused at first. Then, when hunger and the honesty of night loosened her, she unwrapped it with emotion like easing, trapped and ate without speaking, tearing at the bread with the same fierce economy that had once torn meat from bone and rage she remembered as a child. The silence between them was not empty. It hummed with things unsaid, names burned out of memory, small faces that floated up like breath in the dark, the sound of a woman's scream that would not fade, while the cowboy watched her with a gaze that held a sorrow he would not unload. He kept his conversation to tiny, neutral facts, a direction, the weather, the state of the horse, simple threads to stitch a ten of civility between them. His voice was worn, low, and when he spoke of nothing much it was as if he were testing the ground for trust. In the firelight, her features revealed themselves in small details, a nick at the corner of a brow, a faded beadwork pattern half hidden under dust. The way her jaw tightened and then loosened when she thought of something painful in private. These were the maps of a life the town had tried to erase. Memory arrived in flashes for her. Smoke that smelled of pine and things burning. Children pressed against chests and taken. Men in uniforms speaking in a language that had once been mimicry before it became threat. And each fragment closed like a wound when she heard the cowboy's quiet breath beside the fire. He carried a different ruin, a guilt that sat behind his eyes and made him shorten his sentences as if they might explode into confession. Once, under the indifferent stars, he reached into his saddlebag and drew out a small, worn locket. He turned it in his fingers and let the catch click softly, but did not open it for her to see. His restraint felt like a plea. He would not force his history into her world, yet he offered its shape as proof that he, too, had lost something considerable. At one point a coyote wailed in the distance and the sound became a question that neither of them could answer. Who had the right to survive in a country built on other people's graves? She answered in a look, not a word, and in that look there were things that might have been forgiveness or might have been the sharpening of a blade. The distinction was small and dangerous. When the moon climbed and turned the scrub silver, she recited, in a low voice that seemed aimed neither at reproach nor at explanation, a fragment of an old prayer for the safe return of the lost, words in her tongue that smelled of river mud and sweet grass, and the cowboy listened as if he were learning a language of mercy. He did not try to translate, he only sat with the sound, letting it settle over him like a slow rain that might, in time, wash a face clean. Night deepened, and with it a brittle intimacy grew, small confidences exchanged like coins, not the heavy truths that would ruin them, but little salvations, such as how the woman mended a torn strap with thread pulled from her own braid, or how the cowboy could whistle a soft tune that reminded him of a child who had once run barefoot in a dusty yard. Boundaries remained. She kept her sleeping posture curved and watchful. He kept his hand near his gun though he did not draw it, but the distance that had felt like a canyon at the auction softened to attractive land they crossed together when they rode at dawn. The fire died down to embers. The sky emptied its last of red, and the two of them turned toward opposite darks, each to his own memories, each to the thought that perhaps, for the first time since they had been broken by the world, there was a man who would not make a bargain of her pain and a woman who might one day name him not as captor but as companion. Dawn sliced the horizon with a thin, pale blade and the world smelled of dust and cold iron. They mounted in the gray that comes before heat, each movement measured as though they were still negotiating how much of themselves to expose. Town gossip clung to them like tumbleweed caught in a fence. Here a boy on the road said the man was a fool. There an old woman spat and called him meddlesome, and a pair of merchants tutted like judges deciding a petty case. Judgments rose and settled, as small and certain as the dust on their boots. He rode with his hat low, the line of his jaw set into a map of scars nobody asked about, and she kept to a careful distance, eyes scanning the scrub as if the earth itself might betray them. Midway down a ridgeline, a stranger on a pack mule tipped his head and squinted, then spoke the name with the slow care of someone handling a relic. Elias Finch? The word hung in the air and the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elias, if that was the name, had once worn a badge that shone with the authority of lawmen who kept peace by the edge of a gun, and the name ran like a current through the men gathered at watering holes and taverns. Recognition spread not like curiosity but like a stain. A dozen memories stirred in other riders' eyes, faces folding into the news of a lawman who had vanished after a massacre that left more questions than graves. The story rode up behind them. Elias had been in command that night, they said. His men had been outnumbered. Orders had cracked like old leather, and something had happened that made men turn on what they once swore to protect. Families burned, promises broken, and a silence that swallowed officers whole. The stranger's voice carried enough for a dozen accusations, and as the caravan of whispers pressed close, the woman's gaze flicked to the cowboy, reading him like a scratched ledger. Through her narrowed eyes she searched for the outline of culpability. He did not answer the stranger's name. Instead his hands rested on the horn of his saddle, knuckles pale and steady, and in that silent hold there were more admissions than any speech might carry. In his face, under the dust and the patient lines, was a man who had seen the worst of what men do to one another and had chosen, thereafter, to be smaller in the world of men, less of all men than a shadow of one. Wandering the edges where rules fray, the revelation folded her past and his into the same pocket of air between them. She remembered uniforms at the gate, the sound of boots that had once meant a stranger's mercy and later turned into a machine of taking. He remembered the way silence had fallen after orders were shouted and the look on a child's face that had not left him. Towns would tell the story differently depending on their hunger. Some said he ran, some said he fled out of shame. Others whispered he had been the only man to try to stop the carnage until his own fell on him. But those versions mattered less than the fact that now a man with that name had laid $3 silver on a plank to buy what others had deemed worthless. As they rode, a thin, private conversation passed without words. The woman watched his posture for lies. He watched her for signs that acceptance might one day replace distrust. Occasionally, a child's shout from a nearby homestead tugged at him, and for a moment his gaze softened, revealing a memory of small hands and sunlit laughter he could no longer claim. The two of them moved like two halves of a broken mirror, each reflecting a past the other might not want to see but could no longer pretend did not exist. When they paused at a shallow stream to water their mounts, a man on the bank spattered, muttered a curse that was half insult and half dare. But Elias dismounted with the calm of a man who knew all words could not undo what had been done. He took water to the woman, his motion steady, and she took it as if accepting proof that his offer had been more than coin and display. The day stretched ahead with the slow cruelty of desert miles, and every mile they put between themselves and the town added a subtle ledger to the question burning at the center of both their journeys. Why would a man with a name tied to shame risk everything for a woman the world had written off? The answer did not come in a single declaration but in the quiet. A man who had lost law and self had decided, in the small currency of $3 silver and steady deeds, to buy not absolution but the right to try. They rode through a land that seemed more graveyard than country, where the wind told stories better left unspoken, and the earth itself looked scorched by memory. Blackened timbers jutted from the ground like broken ribs, the bones of cabins long picked clean by fire and time, and among them drifted the ghosts of all that had been taken. The Apache woman rode stiff-backed, her face carved into the mask of endurance that only those who had survived too much could wear. But the deeper they went, the more that mask began to crack. The trail cut through what had once been a settlement, half settler, half native, a fragile piece that had lasted a single season before burning to ash. Here, wagon wheels lay half buried beside sun-bleached skulls, and the ground was littered with arrowheads, bullets, and the rusted remains of cooking pots, relics of a war neither side could truly claim as victory. The cowboy, Elias Finch, rode slow through the ruin, his eyes lowered, as if afraid that the wind might name him among the guilty. He knew this place, not by name, but by pattern. The destruction carried the signature of men like those he once commanded, men who believed order could be forged in fire. When she stopped without warning, he followed her gaze to a hillside where the remains of a totem pole stood half-charred, its once bright carvings melted into blackened sorrow. She slid from her horse with a suddenness that startled the air, her knees sinking into the dust. For the first time since he had met her, sound broke from her throat, not a word, but a raw, keening cry that seemed to tear open the distance between earth and sky. Her fingers clawed at the ground, gathering handfuls of ashes that might once have been home, might once have been kin, and the way she wept carried a grief too ancient for language. Elias stood a few paces off, hat in hand, unable to meet her eyes. The sight of her there, this woman who had stared down death with defiance, undone by memory, stripped him bare in a way no confession ever could. He removed his hat and pressed it to his chest, the gesture instinctive, almost prayerful, though he had long ceased believing that prayer could mend anything. Around them, the wind rose, pulling up dust and fragments of voices that seemed to whisper through the brush. He could almost hear them, the screams, the orders, the gunfire, the breaking of treaties spoken in smoke. His mind filled with faces of men he once rode beside, men who had joked over coffee and then lit torches in the same breath. He had told himself, all those years ago, that he was following orders, that a lawman's duty was to preserve order even when justice failed. But standing there, with the echo of her grief cutting through the heat, he felt the weight of that lie pressing against his ribs like a pistol left too long in its holster. The Apache woman spoke then, her voice cracking like brittle wood. She named the place in her own tongue, a soft word that meant something between home and ruin, then whispered names, each one falling into the dust like a prayer. Elias did not understand the language, but the meaning burned clear as fire. He stepped forward slowly and knelt beside her, not close enough to touch but near enough that she could feel his presence. From his saddlebag, he drew out one of the silver dollars, the first of the three, and laid it in the ashes at the foot of the totem, the coin gleaming faintly as if the sun itself hesitated to dim it. "For what can't be paid back," he murmured, the words low, almost swallowed by the wind. She looked at him, tears streaking the soot on her cheeks, and for an instant something passed between them. Recognition, not forgiveness, but the smallest thread of shared loss. The land around them seemed to breathe again. The cicadas resuming their relentless hum, the horses shifting their weight as if to remind them the road still waited. When she finally rose, her face was streaked but steady, her eyes dark with purpose. She mounted without help, and though she did not speak, her silence had changed shape. It was no longer defiance but resolve. As they rode on, the burned land stretched behind them like the shadow of everything neither of them could undo, and Elias felt it settle inside him, the knowledge that ghosts do not vanish when the fire dies. They walk beside you until you decide whether to carry them, or finally face them. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. They rode into the fort at noon when the sun seemed determined to press every secret out into the open, and the sentries at the gate straightened with the practiced suspicion of men who had learned to distrust any story that arrived with dust on its hem. The fort was a square of hard faces and harder rules, a place where uniforms made claims and paper-stamped authority. And when the woman and the cowboy crossed the threshold, a hush moved through the courtyard like a hand searching for a wound. Soldiers filled the yard, young faces set in obedience, older ones threatened with a kind of cynicism earned from years of carrying orders. Then the sergeant stepped forward, nostrils flaring as if he could smell the town's gossip already clinging to them, and demanded to know the woman's business at the fort. The auction had spread like spilled ink, and now the fort men had been informed. She was marked in their books as government property, a prisoner to be returned to the authorities for transfer, and hands reached for the reins as if the law itself might pull her back into its ledger. Elias Finch did not climb down from his horse in a hurry. He eased his mount to a stop and removed his hat with a slow, careful motion, the gesture both politeness and a signal that he would not be hurried into cowardice. The soldiers moved closer, one of them speaking with the blunt certainty of a man who had been taught to assume compliance. "Deliver the woman," they said, "or we will take her by force and place her where she belongs." The words fell flat in Elias's ears, because he had heard that language before in barracks and town squares, language used to cover what men did not wish to name: theft, reprisal, and the appetite for easy justice. The cowboy's hand hovered near his revolver, not in a threatening dance but as an anchor. He knew a soldier's reach, and he knew how quickly law could become violence when men were hungry for order. He met the sergeant's gaze with a steadiness that neither flinched nor flattered, and when he spoke his voice was low and precise, the sentence cut like a clean tack: "She is not your property." Laughter spilled from the soldiers at first, edged with the cruelties of mockery. "$3 silver," they jeered. "What man spends that for a savage unless he wishes to claim a trophy or make a joke of mercy?" The circle tightened, and in the distance a boy's laugh sounded like a cracked bell. Elias did not rise to bait. Instead he said, with an aching quiet, the words that would rest in the air between judgment and truth: "Because no one else paid for what we took from her." The line landed not as a plea but a verdict, and it demanded a weighing that currency could not answer. The sergeant scoffed, calling him a fool and a meddler, and one of the younger soldiers spat, asking whether he meant to claim compensation for conscience. Elias's reply was a look that named the massacre in a way the soldier could not bear. The slow tightness around the cowboy's eyes, the memory of orders barked in smoke, the nights after when men like him counted the cost in faces they could not wake. The woman on the horse said nothing. Her silence had weight, a living accusation that pressed against ledger and uniform alike. The sergeant, face angry at the appending of simple rules, barked another order, and hands moved toward holsters, not for the courtesy of deputizing a citizen but as a threat to remind anyone who challenged the fort's claim what force sounded like. Elias's hand rested on his revolver in a way that suggested he would not yield it lightly. The fort had the law, but he carried a stubbornness that law could not measure, an old lawman's understanding that sometimes the just thing required breaking forms. The woman finally spoke, not pleading but naming, in her thin, measured voice, the place where her family had lain and the names of those taken. When the soldiers heard the cadence of her words, some of them shifted, the hard lines of certainty on their faces becoming question marks, and for a breath the idea that the law could always be right seemed less certain. The sergeant, faced with a knot he couldn't cut with protocol, raised his tone and suggested arrest, but the crowd that had come with the Ford, wives, clerks, men used to tidy answers, found their own unease at the sight of a man willing to stand against custom and the coin that had cemented it. In the end, no grand fight erupted. Instead, the standoff dissolved into the slow, grinding mechanism of bureaucracy. Orders sent, a note written, a messenger dispatched, while Elias and the woman, watched by a circle of soldiers who now bore in their eyes the small confusion of men made human, left the fort as if passing through a field of cinders. As they rode away, the sergeant's last words trailed after them like smoke. Accusing an impotent oath, he called Elias a troublemaker and swore the fort would see justice by the next moon. Elias did not answer. He kept his hand on the rein and felt the heat in his shoulder where the weight of his past pressed, and the woman, who had refused food and favor before, now leaned slightly into the movement of the horse as if the simple act of leaving had become a sort of reprieve. The road ahead was neither safe nor straightforward, but Elias's refusal had bought more than a moment. He had forced a law to look at what it had taken, and in that small, sharp reckoning lay the true price of mercy, paid not in coin but in courage that might yet be contagious. They left the fort behind before the sun had fully climbed, the air still carrying the echo of threats shouted by men too proud to admit hesitation, and by the time the first light turned the horizon gold, Elias Finch and the Apache woman were deep into the wilderness, following no road that any map could name. The land stretched before them like a wound healing over with dust and silence, endless ridges of red rock and dry riverbeds whispering the memory of rain. Behind them, the soldiers would ride soon, and the bounty men would not be far behind, men who needed coin more than conscience, men who would chase anything that promised reward. The horses moved steady through the canyons, their breathing hard and rhythmic, and Elias's face, usually guarded as stone, showed the strain of old pain rising with every mile. When the woman glanced at him, she saw it not as weakness but as something she understood too well, the slow burn of sorrow that lived where loss had taken root. By noon, the heat was thick and punishing. They paused beneath a stand of cottonwoods by a narrow creek, where the air smelled faintly of sage and silt. The woman knelt to drink, her reflection rippling in the water, and as she leaned forward her knee buckled, her body, still carrying the ache of old wounds and new fatigue, finally giving way. Elias was beside her before she could curse the pain, his movements swift but never forceful, his hands steady and respectful as he helped her sit back against a rock. He tore a strip of cloth from his own sleeve, dipped it into the cool stream, and pressed it gently to the scrape along her shin where blood had started to darken the dust. She did not thank him with words. Her people did not waste breath on things that should be understood in silence. But she met his eyes, and for a moment the distance between them, built from fear, history, and mistrust, thinned enough for both to feel the fragile pulse of something new. Elias spoke little, only asking if she could stand when the time came, his voice low, measured, and unassuming, as though he feared words might shatter the small peace that had found them. When she looked at him, she saw a man worn by more than age or travel, a man whose soul had carried too many ghosts too far, yet who still rode as if searching for one small act to make the world right again. That night, they made camp beside a canyon that opened like a scar in the earth. The wind moved softly through the grass, and the fire between them burned smaller than usual, its light painting gold across their faces. She watched him clean his revolver with methodical precision, each motion a ritual of habit that masked something heavier underneath. When he caught her gaze, he paused, then set the weapon aside, the gesture plain and deliberate, trust, extended like an open hand. She nodded once, and though no smile crossed her lips, her eyes softened, the sharp edges of suspicion dulling just enough to let something human flicker through. In the quiet, Elias finally spoke of the stars, how they never looked the same twice depending on where you stood. It was a simple truth, yet she knew what he meant, how perspective changes everything, how even the same wound can look different when seen from another side. She did not answer but listened, the cadence of his voice blending with the sigh of the wind, and when he fell silent again, she whispered a few words in her own tongue, a prayer, or maybe a memory, and for once, He did not ask their meaning. The fire dimmed to embers, and the wilderness held them in its vast, indifferent embrace, two souls marked by the world's cruelty, learning, slowly and painfully, that mercy could live even among ruins. By dawn, when they rode again, something subtle had shifted, not spoken, not seen, but felt. The air between them no longer carried only caution. It carried the first faint thread of trust, as fragile and enduring as the morning light itself. Night had fallen heavy across the canyon, the fire no more than a faint, glowing wound in the dark, and the stars above hung still and watchful, sharp enough to cut the silence. The air carried a chill that spoke of coming storms, and the Apache woman slept wrapped in her blanket, her breath shallow, her face turned toward the faint warmth of the flames. But her dreams were not merciful. They came at her like ghosts with familiar faces, pulling her back to a night that refused to die. The crack of rifles, the screams of her people, the red glow of fire swallowing the sky, and the image of her younger brother running barefoot through the smoke, calling her name until his voice was lost to the roar of white men's laughter. She reached for him in her sleep, whispering his name, but all she grasped was ash and the echo of a command shouted in a tongue that reeked of gunpowder and iron. She woke with a cry, half rising, her hands clutching at the knife at her side. Elias Finch was already awake, his eyes reflecting the dim light of the embers as he leaned forward, his voice quiet but steady. "Easy now," he said, though the words barely carried across the fire. She stared at him as if seeing through him, her chest rising with rage that had nowhere left to hide. The dream clung to her like smoke, filling her mouth, her eyes, her heart, until the line between the man before her and the men in her memories blurred into one. She stood, knife in hand, her voice shaking not with fear but fury. "You were one of them," she said, the accusation burning between them like the last coal of the dying fire. Elias didn't reach for his gun, didn't move at all. He simply sat there, shoulders slumped as though the truth had been waiting too long to breathe. His eyes did not plead, nor did they deny. After a long silence, his voice came, rough, low, and stripped of everything but the truth. "I was there," he said. The words fell like stones, stale and final. The wind carried them away, but their weight stayed. She took a step closer, the knife trembling in her hand, the blade catching what little light was left. He looked up at her then, and there was no defense in his eyes, only the deep, weary confession of a man who had lived too long beneath his own guilt. "I didn't stop it," he added, the sentence barely more than breath, but it struck harder than any bullet could. Her body went still. The air between them turned to ice. For a heartbeat, the canyon itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to win what the past had begun. She saw him not as he was, but as every man who had taken from her, every uniformed shadow that had torn her world apart. Her arm tensed, the knife ready, the ghost surging her hand forward, but then she heard something not in his words, but in the silence that followed. It was not the coward silence of a man begging to live, nor the arrogance of one unashamed. It was the silence of someone who had been dying the same death in pieces every day since. His eyes did not flinch from her hatred. They accepted it, invited it, as if he had already been judged long ago and found guilty by his own heart. The knife fell to her side, her fingers trembling, her breath breaking apart. She turned away, her voice low and broken when she finally spoke. "You should have died with them," she whispered, and the canyon gave back her words with a hollow echo. Elias said nothing. He only nodded once, slow and grave, as though agreeing with a truth he had known too long. The fire cracked once, and the last ember collapsed into darkness. She lay down again, her back to him, her tears silent but fierce, while he sat awake until dawn, staring at the ashes, feeling the weight of what forgiveness would never grant him. They rode into the trading post at late afternoon when the sun had slanted low enough to make every shadow along an accusatory, and the place felt like a held breath, sacks of flour and barrels of salted meat, a creaking sign overhead, and a boardwalk that smelled of old cedar and spilled coffee. At first nothing moved but the loose scrap of paper on the post that skittered across the boards, and then the air shifted as if someone had dropped a stone into still water, a hush that spread outward, 1,000 small, invisible glances turning toward them like wind pulling at grass. Of all the things she had feared since the auction block, Exposure now felt the sharpest, the moment when anonymity broken, the world could point and name her as something less than human. She sat tall in her saddle, braid dull with dust, eyes steady, but the way her hand closed around the rein betrayed the old readiness for flight. Elias Finch reined his horse slow and deliberate, the motion meant to announce calm, and in that quiet he scanned the place with the careful attention of a man who knew how quickly hospitality curdled into danger. The stir that rose was not a single sound so much as a change in weight, voices lowering, a scraping of boots, the shuffle of bodies making space for spectacle, a tension that tightened like wire across the square. He felt it as if the land itself had pressed a hand against his chest and warned him, "Here the world weighs you by what it expects, not what you are." For a heartbeat, the memory of the auction block returned like a shadow at noon. She had stood there once already, the center of a cruel theater, and the fear that the stage would rise again carpet cold into her ribs. Elias said, taller, hat in hand, jaw hardening with a resolve that had the shape of promise rather than bravado. They were not met with words so much as with a low, animal sounds of recognition, those small noises that declare someone known and owned without polite phrases. Eyes fell on her and lingered, slow and hungry, something like a soundless order passed outward, a readiness to take what history had taught them was theirs by right of fear. She could have turned and fled. We had seen that woman run from worse, but instead she held her place in the saddle, the set of her shoulders a silent refusal to be reduced to rumor. Elias did not draw first. He let the air thicken, then cut through it with a single, quiet motion. His hand hovered near the leather of his holster, not in a show of aggression but as a promise that he would not step back. The silence around them pressed, a taut thing, and then a small, sharp noise, an intake of breath, opened into a ripple of murmurs that moved like smoke among the boards. In that movement he recognized the old, dangerous pattern. When a crowd decides a person is less than a person, laws fray and violence finds a doorway. He did not speak much. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, meant not to explain but to anchor. He said, plainly, that she would not be taken from him, and the sound of his words carried the weight of someone who had already paid for wrongs with sleepless nights. She watched him, reading truth in the lines near his eyes and the steady set of his mouth, the small, stubborn things that tell you whether a man will hold his ground. The trading post grew smaller somehow, its aisles and crates fading into the background as Elias became the only thing between her and whatever hungry law the place might call down. Their horses stamped impatiently, and a wagon wheel creaked as if in warning, but no figure moved to enforce the old order. Instead, the place seemed to fold around the fact of them, a living map of choices made in the space between coin and conscience. For all the silence, the moment felt like a trial by breath. The world waiting to see if mercy could be defended by one tired man and the woman he had bought with $3 silver. She did not speak, but when Elias reached out, not to claim but to steady, her fingers closed around his for the briefest instant, an exchange more binding than any writ. When they turned their mounts and left the trading post behind, the boards creaked underfoot like a record of what had passed, and the trail ahead opened with the same indifferent sky on the same waiting miles. Behind them the hush remained, a question left dangling in the air. Could a single stand against cruelty change the shape of a town's appetite? Or would the memory of what they had seen be swallowed by the next rumor that came on the wind? When the name came up again on the trail, spoken not by an officer in uniform but by dust and rumor that clung to their boots, Elias Finch did not flinch. The syllables had weight, a history that unspooled like the braid of a rope, and the Apache woman listened as if the sound itself might rearrange what she already thought she knew. He had carried the name for years like an ache under his ribs, sometimes spoken aloud in taverns as a joke, sometimes cursed beneath a breath, but never confessed like a prayer. Now, with the road stretching slow and empty before them, the story of Elias's fall unfolded not as accusation but as the hard, brittle truth of a man who had stood on the wrong side of orders and paid the price in everything that made a life bearable. Years before, when the world still fought law and mercy were the same thing, Elias had worn a badge and believed in its shape. He had ridden into camps where children huddled behind mothers and had spent more time bending to the small works of mercy, binding wounds, sharing bread, reading names from a ledger, than he had polishing the brass on his chest. He had been the sort of lawman who knelt in dirt to steady a frightened child, who argued with his own men when cruelty felt like easier work than justice. and for that stubborn humanity he had earned both gratitude and the hatred of others who preferred a clean ledger to messy conscience. The night that changed him came with smoke and the sound of order shouted over the crack of rifles. Elias had tried to stop men who turned their backs on the law they'd sworn to keep, had thrown his weight into the breath between command and consequence, but discipline snapped like old leather and friends became executioners in the space of a single, terrible hour. He had watched as the world he knew burned, faces he trusted became masks of greed and fear, and afterward the courts did what courts sometimes do. They looked for neat blame and found none convenient enough, or powerful enough, to satisfy the public appetite. Elias was left holding the shape of a truth that did not fit the tidy boxes of indictment. He was stripped of the badge he loved and given instead a name that fit better with outlaws and ghosts. To townsfolk he became a cautionary tale, the lawman who failed and wandered. But to the Apache woman the story sounded like something else entirely, a man who had seen justice collapse and had chosen exile rather than pretend it had not. As she pieced together the fragments Elias let fall, the quiet admissions at night by the fire, the long pauses and the way his hands trembled when certain stars were named, she began to see the measure of the $3 silver for what they were, not a ransom for conscience, not a fool's coin tossed for show, but the currency of atonement from a man who had nothing left to trade but himself. That truth did not absolve him. It only colored his action with purpose. He had paid, not to buy forgiveness, but to do something he had once failed to do, to protect a child, a woman, a life when the law would not. The dollars were a promise he could keep in the small and immediate world they occupied, one he could fold into deeds rather than speeches. He would not change laws with currency, but he could shield a single life from the machinery that had ground so many to ash. The realization settled between them without ceremony. No speeches, no flourish of remorse, only a quiet understanding that stitched the wound of past into the possibility of future. She watched him then with an attention that was no longer only suspicion. It measured his hands, the set of his jaw, the slow way he breathed when sleep took him, and in those measures she found not sanctimony but stamina. A man who had been broken and chosen to mend something small. Elias did not ask for her forgiveness. Some debts cannot be cleared in a day. He only kept his vigil, kept his watch, and in the doing he made the $3 silver mean more than the coin itself. The road had remained fraught and the past would not relent, but for the first time since the auction block she recognized that his mercy was not spectacle. It was a form of stubborn, costly justice that might, in its own quiet way, be enough. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. The morning broke in silence, the kind that comes before violence, the canyon lying wide and golden beneath a sky still tender from night, and Elias Finch felt the stillness shift the way a hunter feels a shadow move against the wind. He had been awake before the sun, his instincts tuned to the uneasy rhythm of pursuit, and when the first shot cracked through the calm, the sound carried the sharp finality of inevitability. Dust leapt from the ground where the bullet struck, a dry puff that smelled of heat and lead, and before the echo could fade, more followed, rifles sparking from the ridge above, soldiers' muzzles flashing in the thin dawn light. The horses screamed and bolted, one falling where it stood, and Elias threw himself toward the Apache woman without thought. The reflex born from something deeper than reason, his body finding hers and pushing her down into the shelter of a rock outcrop. Another shot tore through the air, and pain followed, a burning that seared through his shoulder and turned his breath into glass. He did not cry out. The sound came instead from the woman, a sharp, guttural noise that held both fury and disbelief, as if the world had dared once again to take what little she had found worth keeping. She pressed her hands to his wound, her palms slick with his blood, and for a moment time slowed. The space between heartbeats stretched wide enough for her to see, truly see, the man who had stood between her and the world's cruelty. There was no more lawman or captive, no more debt of coin or blood. There was only the reality of survival, of one life folded into another by the blunt demand of the moment. Elias tried to push her away, to tell her to run, but she ignored him, her face set like the cliffs themselves, eyes burning with the old fire of defiance that had survived every loss she'd ever known. She reached for his rifle, the weight of it familiar in her hands despite the pain in her shoulders, but rolled to the edge of the rock where the canyon dropped away beneath them. The soldiers had moved lower now, advancing in cautious bursts, their boots sending small avalanches of grit cascading down the slope. But she waited, patient as a snake, until one silhouette broke the skyline. The shot she fired was clean, measured. The recoil snapped through her bones, but she did not flinch. The man fell, a tumble of noise and dust, and she reloaded with steady, practiced motion. Elias, half-conscious, watched her through the blur of pain, his blood marking the ground beside him like a trail of confession, and somewhere beneath the haze of his failing strength he felt an unexpected pride. He had spent his life trying to keep peace with rules that had none, yet here, watching her fight with precision born of rage and memory, he saw something pure, vengeance, yes, but also justice carved from survival. She fired again, then again, and the echoes ricocheted through the canyon like thunder rolling between two broken hearts. When the firing stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than death, filled with a smell of smoke, sweat, and iron. She crawled back to him, breath ragged, the rifle still warm in her grip, and pressed her hand once more to his wound. His eyes fluttered open, the pain giving way to clarity, and he managed a whisper that barely carried. "You shoot better than I ever did," he said, his voice rough but edged with a ghost of something like admiration. She did not answer. She tore a strip from her own skirt, bound the wound tight, and leaned back against the rock, her chest heaving. For a long while neither spoke. The canyon held them both in its stony arms, two souls pressed against the same heartbeat of the earth. Her fury and his guilt no longer opposing forces but parts of the same scar, etched deep, unhealed, but bound together in the simple act of not dying. When the sun finally broke clean over the ridge, it found them still there, breathing, the dust settling around them like a shroud that refused to close. They rode until the sun folded into the lip of the ridge and the world grew softer at the edges. Elias Finch riding with his good hand slack over the reins while his other arm kept a protective hold against the wound that burned like a held coal. Fever wove through him in thin threads that made him shiver in the warm air, and each breath rattled with the weight of pain he refused to voice. The Apache woman led them into a narrow draw where the cottonwoods kept the wind honest and the creek whispered a thin, steady song over stones. She unsaddled his horse with hands that moved as if memory and muscle were one, careful and precise, and then helped him down from the saddle with the strength of someone who had learned to hold things steady without claiming ownership. He sat on a flat rock while she unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers working the cloth away from the wound with a tenderness he did not expect and could not pretend to understand. His shoulder was a dark, angry map, dirt packed into torn flesh, blood dried in the seams, and a slow leak that stained the cloth beneath. He winced but kept his jaw like a line so she would not see the full scope of weakness, because pride is a stubborn thing even when the body is honest. She boiled water in an old tin the way her grandmother had once done in a place now only remembered by name, and the steam rose like an offering as she washed the wound with herbs she gathered from the creekside, willow bark for fever, yarrow to staunch, and a bitter leaf learned in a hush of childhood that smelled of river and smoke. Her hands moved with the focused calm of ritual, whispering words in her tongue under her breath, prayers or remedies, the syllables both medicine and memory, and Elias lay back against the rock and let the world narrow to the near and the necessary. He watched her face as she worked, the firelight catching the planes of her cheekbone, and for the first time he dared to name the truth of what he felt. Gratitude threaded through the old, clotted guild. His voice came hoarse and small when he spoke, and the confession that escaped him was stripped of excuse. $3 silver were all I had left, he said, each word deliberate as a coin laid on a table. After I sold a badge. The sentence landed in the air between them like a wick dropped. She did not look shocked. The information fit into the shape of who he had become and did not unravel anything she had already suspected. Instead, she continued her work with the same steady hand, tamping the herbs into place and binding the wound with leather strips she cut from her own pack. When she finally met his gaze, there was no exaltation, no softening into gratitude that might be expected in another life. Instead, there was comprehension, and in that comprehension the slow alchemy by which anger can temper into something quieter. He had not bought her freedom as atonement in any theatrical sense. He had not expected applause or absolution. He had taken a small action, a private reckoning paid in the only currency left to him, and that private choice had the shape of a promise. She pressed her palm to the leather bandage and held it there until the tremor in his fingers slowed. Then she whispered a phrase from her own old language, not a prayer for his life, but a naming that means, roughly, we remember and we bind. Elias listened and let the syllables settle over him like a cloth, feeling a presence that was part medicine and part mercy. Night grew thick around them and the creek sang on. He drifted toward sleep and dreamed for a moment of a child's small laugh in a yard he did not own. And when he woke, the fever had cooled enough that he could breathe without the knife edge of heat. She kept watch through the darker hours, hands folded, eyes half closed but alert, and each time the horse snorted or a distant coyote called, she checked his breath and felt the evenness return. By morning his color had returned somewhat. The fever had not gone, but it had been taught to walk at heel. The $3 silver sat folded inside a small pouch beneath his shirt, coins that had been transformed from currency into covenant, and when he reached for them later to rub his fingers across their worn faces, she stopped him with a look that meant this debt was neither to be auctioned nor to be paraded. She would not accept redemption a show, nor would he demand forgiveness as payment. Instead, they moved forward with a wound wrapped and a promise kept. The road ahead still long and the man who hunted them still out there. But between the two of them now lay a new ledger, a tacit agreement that some debts are paid not by law but by the steady, repeated acts of care that, in time, might remake what the world had broken. They crested the last ridge and the hidden valley opened like a cupped palm, green and stubborn against the world's burn, and Elias Finch rode into it feeling the strange, sharp relief of reaching a place that smelled of river and root, places that had not yet learned to disappear under smoke. But relief did not soften the set of his jaw, for his shoulder throbbed and fever thinned his thoughts into a narrow, honest hunger for rest. The Apache woman, who had ridden behind him all morning with eyes tuned to every slope, recognized the valley before his mount reached the shallow stream, a low ridge with a line of worn stones where children once played, a knotted cottonwood with a split trunk like an old wound, and the roof lines of dwellings tucked into hollows as if hiding from the sky. When they crossed into the low ground, the people who came out to meet them did not greet them with song or open arms. They came with the wary caution of a tribe that had been learned by loss to expect danger in any stranger's shadow. Faces peered from doorways, lean men and women who threaded their hands through each other's sleeves as if to anchor courage, and children stood behind the skirts of their mothers, watching the arrival of a woman whose name they might know only by rumor. Word moved faster than hooves. A woman returned, a companion riding with a man whose face carried stories, blood, and lawless days. The first voices were thin, then colder, and it was clear some saw her as a wound that might reopen old dangers. Suspicion braided through the crowd like a cold wind, and hunger sharpened it into accusation. She had been with the white world, touched by its ways, perhaps carrying its sickness with her. For reasons born of survival or shame, a small number argued she should leave. Her presence, they said, might invite men with guns and paper. Better the valley remain small and hidden than risk another ruin. Elias felt the shift under him like ground cracking. His fever made every sound a blade, but something steadied him more than will, a stubbornness that was not for pride but for promise. He swung from his mount with effort and fell to his knees to take the measure of the place and the people who might yet kill him for a past they had not chosen. Then, with what remained of his breath, he said simply, hoarse and certain, that she belonged here. The words cut against the hush like an honest tool, blunt and clear, and they hung between the two groups, the tribe that feared contagion of old wounds and the thin, dangerous hope of shelter. Some regarded Elias with contempt, the name of his past like a brand to many who still saw only uniform and failure, but others watched the way he moved and the way he put himself where danger might fall. His presence, wounded and stubborn, argued more persuasively than his reputation. The woman dismounted, her hands steady though her chest held a storm, and when the murmurs rose to a dangerous stammer, she stepped forward as if the space between him and the people were a line she would draw in sweat and voice. She did not plead for him, nor did she speak his name as a plea. Instead, she stood, a measured figure between a man who had paid with coin and ruined in the kin who feared for their small valley. Her voice, when it came, was not raised but edged with the authority of someone who had lived through ruction blocks and ambushes and still knew the worth of a life saved. She named her belonging in a way that surprised those who expected shame or exile. For a moment the world narrowed to the press of eyes in the quiet of a valley weighing its own chance at survival. Elias, leaning on a staff and tasting iron in his mouth where her fever burned, watched her stand with a new form of dignity, not granted by coin, but earned by the simple. stubborn act of defending what she now chose to protect. The tribe's resistance did not vanish like smoke. Old hurts are patient and they do not forgive easily. Yet in that tense, trembling space something like respect took root, not blind acceptance, but the understanding that mercy sometimes arrives wounded and cannot be turned away without becoming something lesser. She stayed between them when hands flexed and when words sharpened, and Elias, who had once been law and long since stripped of its title, found himself steadied by a strange, fragile thing. Redemption that was not his to claim but his to keep by guarding what he had bought with 3 small coins and a life's worth of regret. As the sun fell, the valley did not close around them in hostility. It remained cautious, its people watching, but the first small hearts were lit in a child's laugh, tentative and bright as a bird's first call, stitched a tiny seam in the fabric of fear. The road that had brought them here had not been paid in full, but the moment at the valley's edge showed that some debts are met not with law but with the courage to stand and declare, in the face of hunger and memory, that a person belongs. Elias Finch left before the valley woke, moving like a shadow that did not want to wake the world. He did not tell her he was going, for there are departures that carry more grace when they are private, and there are ends a proud man will not allow another to witness. The dawn was a thin blade of light that cut the night's black away in a slow, weary hush, and he rode with the stubborn economy of a man who had spent the last of his breath on promises and preferred the small dignity of a final, solitary ride. Behind him the valley breathed in sleep in the low sound of a child's murmur, and he imagined her face as she would look when she found the coins, 3 worn silver pieces folded in a scrap of cloth at the corner of her tent, small, blunt, as if to say the account was closed though the ledger would not lie still. He did not want her to sow the last of her days around the image of him dying in the patchwork of twilight. He wanted her to find the coins and know what they meant without watching the motion of his chest slow into silence. The canyon called to him like an old creditor, its lip hollow and honest, and he rode until the valley fell behind him like a shadow becoming memory. The road narrowed and the air grew thin and clean, the world stripped to hard lines and honest wind, and he felt the fever like a pushing weight beneath his ribs. Each breath was a slow negotiation, each mile a small triumph and a further theft on the time he had left. When he reached the edge of the canyon, he dismounted with hands that trembled not from fear but from the work of bearing a long regret. He set his hat on his head, Tiplove as a man who had kept many names in the dark, and sat on the stone as if it were a seat at the reckoning table. He expected the quiet to be a thing that would steady him, but instead the wind moved through his coat and seemed to ask questions he could not answer with anything but a tired smile. He thought of the badge he had sold and the coins it bought, small, stubborn tokens of a life he could not re-earn, and about the woman in the tent who had kept watch over him with hands that mended both rope and wound. He thought of the valley's edge when she had stood between him and those who would have sent him away, of the way her posture had folded into something protective and terrible, and he felt both honored and unworthy. When she found him, he was not surprised. The paths that matter always carry you back to the ones who held faith when all else was dead. She walked up without fanfare, bare feet muffled by scrub, her braid catching dust like a map of miles, and the sight of her made the last of his defenses fall away. He saw in her the woman who had spat at the auction block, the woman who had fired with the surgeon's calm, the woman who had bound his wound with herbs and prayers. He smiled at her then, and the movement was small and fierce, like a man who has kept a secret until there is nothing left to hide. "Guess I finally paid my debt," he said, his voice a dry thing that rode the wind and came back softer than he expected. The words landed like coins dropped into a dark cup, simple, absurd, tender, and with them he meant more than the metal. He meant the nights he had watched, the hands he had studied, the small, stubborn acts that add up to a life lived toward repair. She did not step forward to take his hand. She did not speak a name. Instead, she sank to the stone beside him, her shoulders shaking with a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a prayer. And when her face turned to him, the tears that ran down were not for the end he faced, but for the git she felt in her chest, the restoration of something lost to her long before the auction block, a dignity that had been returned to her by a man who had nothing left to claim. The wind moved through the canyon like a benediction, and Elias closed his eyes at that sound, tasting the valley and river and fever in the last small piece. She cradled his head for a moment, then let it rest against her knee as if making room for both sorrow and thanks, and in the hush that followed, with the sun lifting slow and honest above the rim, he let himself go with a smile that said he had done what he could. She wept then, not for the loss of a man but for the restoration of her own spirit. The understanding that mercy, when bought with nothing but a man's last promise, can still be the thing that saves a life from being only a ledger entry. The canyon held their silence like a witness, and the coins lay folded in the tent where she would find them later, small and gleaming and terrible with meaning. They told the story for years the way people pass a useful tool along, softened at the edges but true at the core, of a quiet Apache woman who moved through the valley like a shadow of good sense, tending the sick, mending roofs, teaching children to read the weather and the river, and taking no coin for what she did because she measured payment in shared bread and repaired trust. Travelers who came by wagon whispered of the 3 silver dollars that hung from a simple thong at her throat, each coin worn smooth by winters and summers and by the small, steady motion of days. And they said the dollars had become part of her like a talisman or a promise. She never made a show of the money. It lay against her chest beneath her blouse where the sun could catch it sometimes when she moved, and in the twilight the coins flashed like a memory. People asked about the cowboy and she answered with the steadiness of someone who carries more than grief. Sometimes she would look toward the far horizon where the land met sky and held the silence long enough that the question fell from the lips of whoever had asked it. Other times she would tell, in a spare tone, how a man with a name like Elias Finch once chose to break a trade that butchered so much else, not with speeches but with 3 small coins and the insistence that one life mattered. There were those who insisted the legend had been embroidered, that men needed a simple ending and that the truth could not be so neatly kept, but those who had seen the woman mean to child's fever or feed an old man whose hands had been ruined by frost would shake their heads and say the story only grew truer with each telling, because mercy leaves traces that do not fade. Her necklace became an answer of sorts. The dollars were a visible proof that what had been bought for a single life could turn into a life that bought more living for others. Children would glance up at the glint and imagine silver moons swinging against the dark, and elders would touch their own chests where memories sat heavy and say nothing at all. She did not boast of Elias's name. She rarely spoke it. But when the desert wind blew in a certain way and the cottonwoods whispered over the valley, the expression she wore shifted, and the words she murmured were not a prayer to any god of vengeance but a vow: I'd rather die than forget what mercy costs. Those words, half defiance, half instruction, became a quiet teaching in the valley, a sentence parents repeated by the hearth like a spell that taught children to measure what they took and what they returned. Time smoothed the roughest edges of the old wounds yet did not heal every scar. In some winters the valley starved and in some summers that overflowed. But through each season the woman moved with a patient dignity that taught settlers and Apache alike how to bind what the world had torn. Travelers who stopped by claimed they felt, in the hush of evening when the sky poured its last light across the land, that the woman's presence was a kind of keeping, an insistence that past cruelty could be answered not by further harm but by steady, practical kindness. And when the wind came down out of the high places and the throat of the desert sang, those who knew the story said she would lift her face toward the line of the horizon and whisper the old line again, not to the listener but to herself, a vow that turned the 3 small coins into a living thing, a memory that refused to die and a lesson for anyone who might ever be tempted to set a price on another soul. That was the odd, stubborn truth the travelers carried on. It was not the money that mattered alone, but what was done after it changed hands, the watching, the tending, the courage to stand between a life and the world's hunger. Because mercy, paid once in silver, must be spent every day in deeds if it is to mean anything at all. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.